I'm going to talk a little bit about packaging die lines. Packaging die lines are very commonly created in Adobe Illustrator because of the layers and the fine registration to the 10,000th of an inch that Adobe Illustrator can maintain. I've got here a fictitious package, and you see a rendering of it. What you'd actually work from probably is a prototype or an actual package that you could disassemble and or measure to get some measurements for a die line overlay. I'm going to switch over to Illustrator to show you the same product in a fictitious package. Now, a lot of times you'll be given the die line overlay, and I'm going to switch to show you that die line overlay by making the other layers invisible, by a paper engineer, somebody who creates this entirely in a program that's meant for engineering packaging. Oftentimes it's a CAD program. But just as many times in my professional career, I've had to create these die lines from scratch. And what you see is one that I put together for that fictitious product that we just talked about using Adobe Illustrator. I want to point out some attributes of a die overlay. You'll notice that there are some solid lines. Solid lines are where the die machine will actually cut out the packaging from the printed panels. Of course, the printed panels just have solid artwork on the board that'll look something like this. And they'll be stacked up and they'll be run through a very large die cutting press. And the die cutting press will actually use your die line overlay to make the blades to cut and score the product so it can be put together in packaging form. So the die line overlay is typically something that somebody else may design, but you may be asked to. And I'm going to use some conventions for our class that aren't necessarily universal. The solid lines indicate a cut. We just mentioned this a few seconds ago. And the dotted lines I'm going to use to indicate what's called a score or a fold. I'll actually put score in the paper so that it folds easier to make the edges of the box. And you notice there's a dot dash dot or a dash dot dash here. That will be a glue area. And a glue area has two specifications. It cannot receive printing, and it usually has some scoring so that any coating on the paper will allow the glue to be absorbed into it. Once I have the die line overlay, the next thing I'm going to recommend is to put down your background layer. Now you'll notice the background layer here goes a little bit past the edges. And that's for good reason. You need to put bleed in. Whenever you have something that prints to the edge, you actually have to print past the edge, and then it gets trimmed down. That process is called bleed. It compensates for any errors and misregistrations that can happen, and they will on press. So I've got a background, and you notice that the bleed area goes past where it gets cut and where it gets folded. You notice that it doesn't go all the way to the tip because we're saving money. In fact, over the course of 1,000,000 units, not printing all the way to the edge of this, since this folded flap will go inside the box and not be seen, could save hundreds, thousands, even millions of dollars depending on how many units are being produced. You'll notice here the same thing, just enough to color the flaps so that when they're folded down, if the flaps expose a little bit, you won't see the white area. But most of it is left unprinted or unpainted by the ink. The next thing you'll notice, once you've got your bleed area for your background that goes past the edges, is you can start to add layers for the different elements. And I put all the labeling elements on one layer, sort of created this very, very quickly using the symbol tools and expanding them just so that we had something to sort of share with the class as far as packaging with some text. And as I turn on and off the different layers, you can kind of see the construction of this. There's a layer that I've dedicated to the background with the bleed. There's a layer that I have the artwork and the text or the type on it, and there's the die line layer. Now typically, we'll set the die line layer to not print. Reason being is what's actually going to get printed out on press is this. And they'll send the die line layer separately to an industrial plant to have the cutting edges made from this die. And those will get mounted on a cutting press. When they're done printing it, they'll feed these units through and they'll actually stamp or cut these out. Now they need to do that because they know exactly how many, and by they I mean your printing contractor, knows exactly how many units up they're going to do. And if they decide to print 4 or 5 of these, for instance, on a sheet, they'll know how to lay out the dies or produce dies for this accordingly. That's the basics of die line. There's also, if you're interested, an associated link. A little bit boring, so 7 minutes of an actual die press in action via YouTube that you can take a peek at. But the basics on your end from design and generating a die line for packaging are so that the actual dies can be cut to stamp out the box from the printed form.